Chapter 2, it's about sociocultural theories of learning, and it covers Vygotsky and Piaget. But before we do that, I want to show you something. I don't know if this happened to you, but if you click on lecture, you get this. Now, if you get this, can't open this page, you can actually still open it by clicking on week 1, chapter 1, lecture 1. Of course, if you if you can't read the if you can't see the lecture, then you're not going to know this. But if you click on that, it takes you to YouTube, and there it is right there, chapter 1. Oh, gee, an hour and a half. Oh my goodness gracious.
You can see
There
from
you
the
go.
syllabus that I'm
There we go.
throwing
Let's
up
get
here.
rid of this. Let's
It's a
get
new
rid of
class,
that. I don't want
kind of new class
you
for
guys
me.
to
It
have
was
to
being
listen
taught
to
by
it
someone that
twice. Anyway, there you go. Okay, so all you have to do is click on it, or up there, it'll take you to YouTube. And that's that. So let's go ahead and get started with chapter 2. As you can see, it's a long chapter. Now, the strange thing is that, yeah, she's a very attractive woman, but I have a shirt just like that. As strange as that is. Well, uh, anyway, there we go. And she's thinking, and that's what thinking, reasoning, and I don't know if she's using her language, but she's got notes right here. Anyway, she's thinking and reasoning. People are constantly changing throughout their lifespans. Children's bodies undergo enormous changes as they progress from helpless newborn to coordinated toddler. Children also go through changes in their ability to think about their world. They learn to communicate using sophisticated language tools. They also learn to interact with others in socially complex ways. These changes represent our unique human experiences, and researchers have gathered an impressive body of knowledge regarding this process. Development refers to the systematic continuities and changes in the individual over the course of life. Developmental changes are not transitory, like changes in mood, but follow a specific order and are relatively permanent. Some developmental changes are the result of adaptation. Adaptations are environmentally dependent changes that allow us to better function in the world. And that's what we're trying to do with Canvas. We're trying to adapt to a new system. So when we do, it'll be an adaptation, but not a developmental adaptation. It'll just be a technological adaptation. For example, when a child who has no experience in structured pre-K program enters school, she may have difficulty sitting during circle time, being quiet while her teacher is talking, and raising her hand to speak before class. As she gains experience in her new environment, however, she is likely to adapt, changing her behavior to better meet the demands of the classroom. There are many ways that we might change to become better suited to our environment. We might change the way we think about ourselves, that's personal development, the way we interact with others, that's social development, or the way that we regulate our own behavior, self-regulation development. We may also make adaptive changes in the way that we think or remember. That's cognitive development, depending on our experiences. And this all takes place in our brains. Maturation refers to changes occurring naturally, irrespective of environmental demands. And this is me right here. I don't wear a cane, but I don't use a cane. But I'm 75 years old. That's my mother when she was pregnant. That's me when I was a baby, and I got taller. My head, look how big my head is. My goodness. Well, anyway, I don't think I ever had that much hair. And there I am right now. Maturational changes are largely genetically driven. For example, we are all genetically programmed to reach a certain height, and this is likely to be unaffected by the environment unless we experience severe malnutrition or physical injury. And of course, I just read an article dealing with athleticism, and it said that They've done studies looking at the ability, what were they doing? The ability to hang from a bar or something. Anyway, they were using that to judge athleticism, and what they determined was that athleticism is genetic. It's based on genes. It's based on height. It's based on weight. It's based on the fast twitch and slow twitch muscles. It's based on a lot of different things that give you athletic abilities, but only certain people will have it. You can't train people to become athletic unless they genetically are. You can you can train them to be as good as they possibly can be, but of course we just watched the Olympics. I didn't watch the Olympics for I don't know why I didn't. Oh, I was working on this stuff. Lucky me. Anyway, okay, so maturation. We must reach a certain maturational level before we can acquire a particular skill. Take, for example, an 8-month-old infant who is just learning to crawl. Walking would clearly allow her to move about the world more easily, yet until her musculature develops enough to support walking, this adaptive skill cannot be achieved. Maturation is important in the development of walking. It is, however, much more difficult to determine the role of maturation in more complex human behaviors such as cognition, language, and socialization. Maturation and adaptation interact in complex ways, making it difficult to tease apart the specific role of either process as development becomes more complex. Although there are similarities in our development, we each progress at a unique developmental pace. This individual pacing occurs for both maturation and adaptation based development. Take puberty. Some girls begin to show pubertal changes at 10 or 11 years of age, while others showed no signs of puberty until the age of 13 or 14. Most of us went through similar physical changes, even though the process began at different times. And of course, this is a something that happens to everybody. Everybody either develops or doesn't develop early or late. They're fast bloomers or late bloomers. I was a late bloomer, and for that reason, I didn't start running high school track until I was a junior in high school because I hadn't started maturing yet. But then when I was a junior, I started changing. How old was I? I graduated at 17, so I guess I was 15 or 16 years old. Anyway, there you go. I didn't shave until I was, I don't know, in my middle 20s. Oh my goodness gracious. But a lot of that has to do with genes. I don't really shave a whole lot to this day. You walk around and you see these guys with all these really long beards and really thick, heavy beards. And, I could never do that. I could never grow that. For one thing, my hair was blonde and it's fairly thin. Anyway, I'm not bald except right on top of my head. And I can't see it, so it doesn't bother me. Differences in timing of developmental changes can impact other aspects of our functioning. When we reach puberty, we learn to adapt and incorporated these new feelings and physical characteristics into our lives. For some of us, adapting to change is easy. For others, the experience is more difficult. These differences interact with other aspects of our functioning in complex ways. For example, research shows that the way we adapt to the changes of puberty is related to maturational timing, or how early we enter puberty. In general, early pubertal development is associated with poorer outcomes compared to typical or late development. This is especially true for young females. Not especially true for boys, but we'll get into that in just a second. Using an individual's subjective evaluation of their maturity, research shows early pubertal development in girls is associated with depression, antisocial behaviors, higher number of sex partners, drug use, fewer reports of good health, and higher body mass index. I used to have a student that when I was teaching at Mississippi University for Women, and when she was in the third grade, she looked like an adult. She had developed that rapidly. She was only 9 years old. Yeah, she was only 9 years old, and she looked like a teenager. And the boys just wouldn't leave her alone, and the girls just ignored her, the third grade girls, because well, she didn't look like them. Anyway, it was a terrible, terrible time for her. And like I said, the boys would not leave her alone. They would drive past, drive past the elementary playground and hoot at her. And of course, that was fairly traumatic for her. Anyway, things didn't turn out very well through high school. But she she eventually bought half the buildings in the town that she lived in Columbus, Mississippi. So she owned most of downtown. So she got her revenge. She never dated, though. She never dated because she thought boys, there was something wrong with them. And she's probably right. Results for boys are similar with antisocial behaviors, higher number of sex partners, drug use, fewer sleep hours, and higher BMI. And that's according to Hoyt in 2020. Now, this is something relatively new because we used to say it was better for boys to be early developers because here they became athletic heroes in junior high school. Didn't always carry through to high school, but the early development was always a positive for them. So this is kind of new. What Hoyt has said. Maybe it's true. I was a late developer, so I don't know. It seemed to me that the early developing guys had a leg up on the rest of us, but that was males, not the females. Females, the guys just wouldn't leave them alone. As you can see from these data, the concept of developmental variation is important, sometimes leading to very different outcomes. Most of us crawled before we walked and walked before we ran. Geez, that's mean, isn't it? He's teasing her. This example of the progressive development of motor skills illustrates the orderly progression of skill acquisition that occurs in children. Further, we did not learn to walk in an hour or a day, but learned gradually over the course of many months. The developmental progression of motor skills is less complicated and easier to quantify than determining the sequence of cognitive development. However, most theorists agree that cognitive development also proceeds in a systematic, orderly, and gradual manner. Theorists disagree about particular cognitive milestones and their sequence in cognitive development. But we all agree, no matter what our research is or how we're doing it, that it is that the milestones, whether we agree on what the milestones are or where they should be, we agree that it's fairly systematic, orderly, and relatively gradual. Different cultures, subcultures, social classes, racial or ethnic groups, and disability groups have unique socialization experiences, which exert strong influences on the values, beliefs, and competencies of individuals who are members of the group. By viewing development as occurring within social, cultural, and historical contexts, we lay the foundation for developing an understanding and appreciation of diversity and multiculturalism. This requires a more encompassing conception of difference. Whenever we talk about difference, we are automatically making a comparison. If we know something important about academic level, we don't know if the skill in this area differs from those of other children. If we know the child's age, we can compare them to other children at their age and see if they are above average. This determination of difference is made based on an interindividual comparison or a comparison between children. We may also be interested in making intra-individual comparisons or comparisons within an individual. We might wish to know if they are advanced in other areas of development before we can determine an appropriate educational placement. We could compare their functioning in many different areas to determine areas of strength and weakness outlining an academic plan to best suit his individual needs. Thus, the concept of difference is always relative, involving comparisons between or within individuals. As our classrooms become increasingly diverse with regard to student culture, social class, race, ethnicity, and disability status, we're faced with the important task of providing educational experiences that support student differences. While the needs of students with significant developmental delays are usually addressed through special education, many students have developmental differences that do not developmental differences that do not meet criteria for inclusion in this program. Today's regular education teachers are expected to work with students who have a variety of educational needs. This makes an understanding of developmental difference central to the field of education. In searching for an understanding of why discrepancies or differences in human development exist, it is easy to narrowly focus on differences between individuals, interindividual. By focusing on the way a child differs from others, we often lose sight of interacting strengths and weaknesses within the children. And of course, this is Superman, and his strength is his muscles, and his weakness is kryptonite. Not sure why he's talking to the owl, but hey. Effective intervention is best achieved by understanding the complexities of the whole person. One way to think about the whole person is to imagine an individual as a composite of many dimensions. The dimensional model of intra-individual difference is particularly important in educational settings since all students have a unique learning style made up of different strengths and weaknesses. Considerable research has been undertaken to better understand the impact of different learning styles in the classroom. And research shows that effective learning is enhanced when teachers consider individual strengths and weaknesses when planning instruction. Tailoring instruction to meet the needs of increasingly diverse learners is a central challenge for today's educators, requiring knowledge of research and theory across many disciplines. You may be confused as to why in the world all of a sudden we're talking about diversity when education in the United States has always been relatively diverse. And the answer is because it was diverse only in rural or in urban areas. It's never been really diverse in rural areas. If you wander around Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa, for that matter, most little towns, most villages that you would visit were either settled. They were primarily settled by the same people. In other words, they were settled by Germans, they were settled by Presbyterians, they were settled by Methodists, they were settled by Swedes, and usually to feel comfortable with where they lived, people would live around people that were like them. So you had Swedish villages, you had German villages, you had, villages. I grew up in a town that had 3 Methodist churches, as weird as that sounds. It was a Methodist town, as strange as that is. We had an American Methodist church, an English Methodist church, which is a Wesleyan church, and Evangelical United Brethren, which is the German Methodist church. And so primarily everybody in town were Methodists, whether they were German, English, or they had been in the United States for an extended length of time, as weird as that sounds. So that's the way the United States was actually settled. It was settled by people traveling with each other who were very similar to each other. It wasn't just the Mormons who traveled to Utah as a group. Almost everybody traveled as a group. They would come in as immigrants with other farmers or other whatever, miners or whatever they were, and then they would just try to find some place with cheap land. That's what they were after. Everybody was after cheap land. because that was something you couldn't get in Europe. In Europe, if uh, if the land was empty, it was owned by somebody who was, a royal person, a monarch, one of the members of the monarchy. But in the United States, of course, we don't have a monarchy. Don't tell Donald Trump that. Oh, I shouldn't talk about politics. Okay. Cognitive neuroscience is the study of relations between the brain and thinking. And now we're going to talk about the brain. We're going to talk about neurons. Sorry about that. This is physiological psych, but we're just going to cover it for about 10 or 11 slides. We're learning about the brain and cognition at an exponential rate, and this research has many implications for educational practices. And this is true. We're doing a lot more research with the brain than we've ever done before. Before, it was kind of a mystery. All we could do was X-ray it. But now we can do MRIs, we can do PET scans, we can trace thoughts through the brain. Whereas we couldn't do that before. Now all of a sudden we can look at individual neurons. Neuroscience research complements our understanding of individual and developmental differences in learning and has been used as support for a variety of instructional styles. Some researchers argue that the application of neuroscience research to the classroom is premature, asserting that the way in which findings in neuroscience map onto what we know of development, cognition, and learning is still unclear. And that is pretty much true, except that if it works, it works. Okay? The brain is an incredibly complex structure of the human body composed of hundreds of billions of neurons. Specialized brain cells send and receive information by conducting electrochemical impulses. A typical neuron is composed of three main parts: the dendrite, the cell body, and the axon. And the reality is, we don't just have neurons in our brain, we have them all over our bodies. So, this is kind of incorrect. This is the cell body right here. You can tell because it has the nucleus. It's also known as the soma. Dendrites, these are the dendrites, these little tendrils that stick out. And they feed the axon. And this is the information comes in through the dendrites, goes through the soma, goes down the axon to the axon terminal, and then this will communicate with something. It will communicate with a muscle, communicate with another neuron. It will communicate with many neurons. That's the function of the cell body of the neuron. The dendrites are responsible for receiving incoming signals from another neuron. This causes an electrical signal to travel down the dendrite and move across the cell body, which is responsible for carrying on basic life functions. When the sufficient signal comes to a specialized region of the cell called the axon hillock, it triggers an electrochemical signal to continue down the axon. The axon serves a transmission function, sending information to other neurons. Propagation down the axon is accelerated if the axon is myelinated. This is a non-myelinated neuron, and this is a myelinated one. And what happens? This accelerates the impulse. The myelination does. So if we look in a brain, if we cut into somebody's brain, the myelination is white. So all the white matter that we see in the brain is myelinated. That's really rapid stuff. But when we talk about gray matter is where all your thinking parts take place. That is non-myelinated neurons. If it were faster, would we be smarter? Maybe, or we would do stupid things faster than we do them now. The signal continues down the axon until it reaches the terminal button. The signal causes the production of vesicles, which are filled with a neurotransmitter. Vesicles move the end of the terminal button where they fuse with the membrane, releasing the neurotransmitter into a space between neurons called a synapse. Moving across the synaptic cleft, they bind with receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, creating a new signal in the cell, starting the cycle again. This process is plastic, meaning that the strength of the neuronal signal is modifiable by experience. This flexibility gives rise to the remarkable breadth that we see in human learning. As more and more synapses form among neurons, they begin to develop into organized circuits or networks, allowing distant neurons in the brain to communicate with one another. The nature of neuron communication is at least partially dependent on its physical location in the brain. Certain areas and structures in the brain are designed to carry out specialized functions. The cerebral cortex, which is the area of the brain most directly implicated in thinking and learning, is one of the most highly specialized brain areas. The cerebral cortex can be divided into 4 different lobes: the frontal lobe, the blue one, the temporal lobe, the green one, the parietal lobe, which is a white one here, and then the occipital lobe, which is the red one. Each of these brain areas is specialized for certain functions, although most human activities require many brain areas working together. And of course, in your brain, it's not painted white, blue, red, and green. That is just done so that we can, okay, anyway. For example, the temporal lobe is part of the brain primarily involved in processing auditory information. It's close to the ears. Ears are right here. Yet in order to hear and interpret language, many different areas of the brain must work together. And one of them is right there. That's Wernicke's area. The temporal lobes are also, Wernicke's area is right here. I'm sorry. The temporal lobes are also important in memory and selective attention with people who have temporal injuries, exhibiting a wide range of problems related to auditory processing, verbal learning, and sensory integration. And I used a period instead of a comma. Sorry. Okay, so you get hit in the head. One of the things that we do when we're looking for a concussion is we're trying to determine if there's any damage that is done. So one of the things we're going to do is say, how many fingers am I holding up? Now that has to do with eyesight, and it also has to do with your hearing. How many fingers am I holding up? That's a question that you have to answer. And if you can see that I'm holding up 3 fingers, that means the occipital lobe is not damaged. And if you can hear what I'm saying, how many fingers am I holding up, then now we know that the side of your head isn't hurt. Now the way the brain works, it kind of floats around in a pool in your brain, and if you hit one side of your head, this thing rebounds back and forth like a, I don't know, like a ping pong ball. Anyway, it'll hit both sides. So if you get hit on the side of the head, it'll hit on both sides of the head. If you get hit in the front of the head, it also hits you in the back of the head, with the brain moving back and forth. Anyway. The frontal lobes play a role in many human behaviors, including planning, anticipating consequences, and inhibiting behavior. Behaviors which are known collectively as executive functions. This is really important. Executive functions. It's how you know stuff. The frontal lobes also play a role in language problem solving and movement. People who have damage to this important brain area often have a wide variety of deficits, including impulsive behavior, poor judgment, and difficulty planning for the future. This cognitive and behavioral profile is similar to the problems seen in children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, leading many researchers to believe this disorder may have origins in the frontal lobe's deficits. So there you go. This is new thought. This is a new theory, by the way. We never talked about this 5 years ago. We never talked about ADHD and frontal lobe deficits. The parietal lobes are responsible for integrating somatosensory information such as touch, temperature, and pain. That's a frontal lobe here, and that's the parietal lobe. The next one back. The parietal lobes are also involved in special activities such as being able to visualize the way an object will look from different angles and understanding the relationship among objects in space. Parietal lobe functions strongly correlate with math performance. Damage to the parietal lobes can result in problems with spatial relations, abnormalities in body image, and impaired body senses. The occipital lobes are primarily responsible for visual processing. Damage to this region can result in visual perceptual problems, and if the damage is extensive enough, blindness. And of course, that's why we're holding up the three fingers, asking you, are there three fingers or are there six? Because if you're seeing double, then you won't be able to count the number of fingers. Near the area of the juncture between the occipital, temporal, and parietal lobes lies an area of the brain called the angular gyrus, which is important in reading and writing activities. People who have damage to the area of the angular gyrus lose the ability to read and write, while language function is maintained. Another important aspect of the cerebral cortex is that it is divided down the midline into the left and right hemispheres, each of which contains all four lobes discussed above. The two cerebral hemispheres are connected by a band of axons called the corpus callosum. That means calloused body is what corpus callosum means. Corpus means body, and callosum means callus. So it's a calloused body. It's thick and it's hard. The corpus callosum allows information to travel back and forth between the left and the right sides of the brain. Each side of the brain has specialized functions like the specialization seen in the four lobes of the brain. The right side of the brain controls the motor functions of the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the motor functions of the right side of the body. So if you have a stroke on the right portion of your brain, in the right hemisphere of your brain, you'll have left side of your body will be paralyzed or will malfunction. For example, moving your right arm results from a brain signal originating in the left hemisphere. We consider specialized brain function lateralized when they are primarily controlled by one hemisphere. Like motor function, language ability is another lateralized brain function. In most right and left-handed people, language is lateralized to the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is more dominant for nonverbal visual spatial creativity, emotional processing. A few left-handed people show the opposite pattern, and some individuals show a mixed laterality or a lack of hemispheric dominance. This mixed laterality has been correlated with learning disabilities in reading. However, a causal relationship has not been established. A causal relationship has not been established. Oh my goodness. Okay. Developmental neuroscience is the study of the orderly progression of changes in the brain that occur across the lifespan. Research from developmental neuroscience confirms much of what we already know and are already implementing in the classroom. Research tells us that brain development is dependent on experience or environmental input. Research has shown that animals deprived of experiences during development do not develop connecting circuits in the brain, which are as complex and organized as animals that receive stimulation. Raising animals in enriched environments leads to an increase in the number of connections in the brain. These findings indicate that brain development increases in complexity and organization as a function of experience. Research also shows that the brain is most receptive to environmental input in childhood. Synaptogenesis peaks in early childhood, after which it declines until it stabilizes during mid to late adolescence. Although the brain continues to form new connections as a function of experience throughout life, It forms connections more intensely during childhood. This is synaptogenesis. Watch this neuron right here. Oh, there it goes. It's moving. All these connections, all these new connections. This is because of experience. And this is reaching out. There he goes. Okay. Anyway, synaptogenesis. In other words, the synapses are growing. More synapses are being created. Since the brain develops as a function of experience, it follows that teachers, by providing learning experiences, are helping increase the complexity and organization of their students' brains. While we know that effective teaching increases learning, neuroscience research gives us a physiological basis for this phenomenon. Research indicates that using meaningful context for teaching new information enhances learning. If we reflect on research findings from a variety of disciplines, including education, cognitive science, and developmental neuroscience, we may better understand why the use of context enhances learning. Neuroscience research tells us that when learning occurs, new connections are made between neurons. We just watched the synaptogenesis. We just watched that. And these are circuits that are being created. These are new connections that are being created. These connections in the brain are organized into networks or circuits. Examining learning at the level of the neuron is looking at the microstructure. This is important when documenting the foundation of learning, but it is difficult to translate this information into functionally relevant learning strategies. Knowing that specific neurons are communicating more does not usually lead to an instructional strategy that teachers can use in the classroom. Brain-based educators are interested in macrostructures of learning. This approach focuses on whole brain structures rather than specific neurons and how they operate during learning. Yes, of course. When a student is attempting to learn something new, putting the new information in a meaningful context causes already existing circuits of neurons to activate, enabling the student to link new information to existing knowledge. Cognitive psychologists call this linking of new information to already known information elaboration, and it has been shown to be a very powerful memory technique. This is the best way to teach somebody to use already existing knowledge to assist the new knowledge. If we tie an established context to the new information, we will activate much larger areas of already existing neurons in the brain, making it easier to link the new information to the information that we already know. An effective teaching practice, multisensory instruction, seeing, feeling, hearing, can aid in elaboration. This research does expand our understanding of how the brain is working during teaching and learning. Neuroscience is a rapidly developing field of study, and the future may yield more specific information that can be applied to educational practice and policy. Okay, now we're going to talk about Lev Vygotsky. This guy's really kind of an interesting fella because he was from Russia. He was born in 1896. So when he was born, the Tsar was in power. And then throughout much of his life, in 1917, there was the Russian Revolution occurred, and the Bolsheviks took over in 1917. So for 17 years, he was a Soviet because he was part of the Soviet Union. All right, so for the first 21 years of his life, he was under the Tsar, and then he was being controlled by the Bolsheviks in Russia. Lev Vygotsky, interesting fellow. So how in the world did he stay out of trouble? Well, the way he stayed out of trouble was that he was not only a theorist, but he was also living in rural areas, and that's where he did most of his research. Okay, so let's talk about him. Okay. During the early part of the 20th century, the Russian theorist Lev Vygotsky developed a theory of development that received relatively little attention in the United States until the 1970s and 1980s, when his ideas became widely circulated among educators. Now, why in the world did we ignore Lev Vygotsky? He died in 1934, so most of his theories came out in the early 30s. So we ignored him for 40 or 50 years. Now, why in the world would we do that? And the answer is because Lev Vygotsky was a Russian. Okay, and politically, we didn't like the Russians very much. As a matter of fact, we didn't like them at all. And then during World War II, of course, we disliked the Nazis even more. So the Russians became the Soviet Union became our allies. But then afterwards, the Cold War started in the 1950s. So what happened in the 1970s? Well, things were starting to normalize in the world. We realized that just because somebody was Russian, they weren't evil, and it didn't have anything to do with communism. His theories didn't have anything to do with communism. We had this blind spot where anything communist was rejected. We had other blind spots, but this was a huge one. So anything coming out of the Soviet Union or Russia was rejected, and we didn't change our minds until the 1970s and 1980s. Now, the interesting thing is that in the 1970s, I started studying psychology. I had studied English before that, and laboratory technology. So in the middle 70s, I started studying psychology, and by golly, when I first started studying psychology, I'd never even heard of Lev Vygotsky. And so it was probably 4 or 5 years later that finally somebody started talking about Lev Vygotsky. When we were talking about education, the only person we talked about was Erik Erikson. We didn't talk about Vygotsky. We didn't talk about Piaget. We're going to talk about Piaget in just a moment. So a lot of this has to do with politics. As stupid as that sounds, what do politics have to do with education? And the answer is, sadly, politics run education all too often. Anyway, okay, so Lev Vygotsky, we ignored him for 40 or 50 years, and the reason we did it was political. Vygotsky is considered a sociocultural theorist because of his interest in the nature of social interactions and the ways in which social processes shape an individual's thinking. Sociocultural, that sounds like communism to me. Well, actually, that's one of the reasons why we didn't even look at his theories, because even the people that had read them, there wasn't a whole lot coming out of the Soviet Union. It was in Russian. Nobody was really reading it. But if we had read it, we would have just assumed it was Russian propaganda. More Soviet propaganda, them trying to change us. Educators came to realize that Vygotsky's sociocultural theory had direct bearing on the process of formal schooling and the pivotal role of the teacher, because formal education is inherently a dynamic social process. Okay, it's a dynamic social process. Does this have anything to do with communism? Eventually we figured, well, no, it really doesn't. So maybe it's not communist propaganda. Maybe we should look at Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky's basic theoretical premise is a departure from many developmental theorists, focusing on the process of development rather than the product. And this is what was happening before. Education was being controlled by behaviorism, this concept of behaviorism in the 50s and 60s. So education was a lot different back then. And of course, this is when I was in grade school and high school. So my education and your education are probably very much different, mainly because of the focus of the theorists that were running the theories of education. Vygotsky called socially mediated change in behavior an intermental change. Intermental changes are modifications in thinking resulting from our social interactions. intermental. In other words, we are trading back and forth, ideas back and forth between different individuals. Mental in this sense is not an activity exclusively within the mind of an individual. Vygotsky actually saw mental actions occurring in the socially mediated space between individuals. Vygotsky felt that this was the primary place for developmental changes in thinking. Vygotsky believed that social processes are the fundamental basis for thinking. A secondary process called intramental changes refers to how individuals adapt socially derived mental processes to govern their own thinking and behavior. So it goes from intermental ideas being transferred from one person to the next to intramental. That is when it's in your own mind. Egocentric speech begins as overt talking while carrying out an activity. As individual becomes more adept at guiding their own performance through speech, they will begin to use private speech, which eliminates over talking, but will continue to use subvocal speech to guide their actions. And if you have had any 2 or 3-year-olds, you see them doing this all the time. This type of speech is addressed to the self and is used for the purpose of self-regulation and motivation rather than communication. According to Vygotsky, this inner form of speech is thinking, which is developed via social processes. Thus, Vygotsky's theory focuses on the process by which our thinking develops, with language and subcultural interactions as fundamentals of this process. Vygotsky recognized the importance of this theory for formal education since many of society's fundamental mental tools are relayed to the individual during the formal educational process. Examples of these fundamental tools are not only verbal words and language, but also written language, counting systems, works of art, maps, and diagrams. It is in the school environment through intermental processor social interactions with others that we learn to use these social and cultural tools in our thinking. That is, the processes become intramental. It is important to emphasize that since our mental products are directly derived from our interactions at a social level, society and culture dictate how we perceive ourselves and the world around us. According to Vygotsky, we are able to direct our mental tools to whatever attracts our interest. However, the tools we have available for this work are simply those derived from the larger social context. This places educators in a very sensitive position because they significantly impact students' experience, the social world, and how they come to think for themselves. Vygotsky's ideas provide a theoretical foundation for teaching whereby the social environment of the classroom is used to optimize cognitive development. The benefit of Vygotskyan approach to instruction is that much of the natural social interactions that occur between a teacher and student can be purposefully directed to enhance the educational process. For example, during the beginning of a new school year, teachers spend considerable time getting to know the students and helping them become familiar with the classroom. Vygotsky's theory holds that social interaction has the potential for a dramatic impact on education. If we apply Vygotsky's ideas to the classroom, the earliest part of the educational process consists of a preliminary dynamic between teacher and student. During this time, the teacher begins to learn 3 types of information. First, the teacher acquires an understanding of what skills a student has already acquired and can perform independently. These skills are likely to benefit from continued reinforcement, but are not as likely to need the active guidance of the instructor. The teacher must then develop a sense of what skills are realistically beyond the child's current ability, even if help is given. This leaves a third piece of information that the teacher needs to acquire. That is, discovering what the student has not already acquired, but is capable of learning with assistance. Vygotsky referred to this area of potential development as the zone of proximal development, or the distance between the skills the child has already internalized and the skills the child could learn from appropriate assistance. I think I turned it on hotter. And that's a zone of proximal development. That's what it looks like. And that's what it looks like. If the teacher uses interactions with students as a tool to understand the child's particular zone of proximal development, then sensitive and effective instruction becomes a reality. It is important to remember that much of the teacher's assessment of a child's zone of proximal development can be embedded in everyday interactions. It is also important to realize that each child's zone of proximal development is likely to vary, not only in terms of absolute level, but also in relative distance between known skills and skills the child could learn with assistance. That is, some students will only be able to learn a few skills beyond their current level of development, whereas other students will have a greater range of skills that they could potentially learn with appropriate assistance. After a teacher has successfully determined the zone of proximal development for each child, instruction can be tailored to the student or to groups of students who have similar zones of proximal development for a given skill. Jerome Bruner first used the term scaffolding in the 1970s to refer to instruction that is based on Vygotsky's notion of supporting the development of new skills within a student's zone of proximal development. So scaffolding was not Vygotsky's term, it was Bruner's term. Scaffolding does not use explicit step-by-step instructions. It supports learning by helping the student engage in purposeful and meaningful usage of psychological tools. The scaffolding process consists of three main characteristics. This first is contingency and refers to the teacher adapting instructions to the specific learning needs exhibited by the student. For example, a teacher may model a particular learning product, but also provide critical foundations just beyond the student's skill level that are necessary to reach the desired outcome. The student then attempts the skill on her own, with the teacher monitoring student performance and providing sensitive feedback. Over time, the teacher minimizes assistance through the process of fading, and the intermental dynamic becomes intramental, with the student moving toward independent practice. This process provides a gradual transfer of responsibility for learning from the teacher to the student. Vygotsky's theories provide us with valuable insights into the process of effective education. Yet, if a teacher must begin each school year with a systematic assessment of each child's individual developmental level, followed by individualized instruction for each child based on that assessment, then a classroom of 25 children becomes difficult, if not impossible, to teach. While every teacher is indeed confronted with as many unique zones of proximal development as they have children, development is an orderly and gradual process, one that proceeds similarly for most children. Teachers should and are expected to factor this into their educational programming. This helps teachers educate a group of students while still providing the support each student needs. Now we're going to talk about Jean Piaget. Piaget is really interesting because he's from Switzerland. That's not what makes him so interesting. What makes him so interesting is the fact that we ignored him for a really long time. But we'll talk about that in a second. Jean Piaget became one of the most prolific and influential scientists of the 20th century, contributing much of our understanding of the developing child and greatly influencing education practice. Like Vygotsky, Piaget was interested in understanding the development of mental abilities. Piaget's focus was children's active, inquisitive exploration of the world, and he used a descriptive observational method. His observations resulted in a detailed theory regarding what children and adolescents are able to accomplish cognitively at different ages, viewing cognitive development as an orderly sequence of stages. Piaget divided the development of cognitive processes into 4 stages, each identified by qualitative changes in a child's thinking. Piaget believed that these qualitative changes in thinking were facilitated by the child's active exploration and attempts to understand the world. Piaget's quest to understand the developing mind resulted in a vast amount of research and observation. From this work, it became clear to Piaget that a child's cognitive development was far from haphazard. Key developmental processes systematically drove it. He believed cognitive changes result from 3 basic processes: equilibration, assimilation, and accommodation. When our understanding of the world is adequate for making sense of the situation we encounter, Piaget theorized a state of cognitive equilibrium existed. Now, we need to talk about who Piaget is. Piaget, like I said, Piaget was Swiss. There we go. Piaget was Swiss. Now, why is that important? Well, if you know anything about Switzerland, we'll go back. If you know anything about Switzerland, you know that Switzerland speaks 4 languages. They speak, the ones on the French side of Switzerland speak French, the ones on the German side of Switzerland speak German, and the ones on the Italian side of Switzerland speak Italian. Now, there's also a local dialect called Helvetian, and it's not French, German, or Italian. Anyway, so most people in Switzerland speak at least 2 languages, if not 3 or 4. Piaget lived on the Swiss side, the French side of Switzerland, and he spoke French, and that was what he wrote in. And because he wrote in French, and because the United States was mad at France, we didn't read things that came out that were written in French. As stupid as that sounds, and it has to do, once again, with politics. The French were more liberal than we were in the United States, and because of that, we just kind of rejected them. We rejected their ideas. We didn't read anything that was written in French. So for the longest time, nobody read Piaget. And then in the 70s and 80s, once again, somebody picked up Piaget. He'd been theorizing for years. It had been accepted in Europe, but of course, we didn't know anything about it. And then in the 70s and 80s, somebody read it and said, hey, look, this is a good idea. Probably they talked to somebody from England or Germany, and they said, oh, you don't follow Piaget? What's wrong with you? And so we started looking at Piaget and realized, oh, this is a really good theory. Maybe we should do something about it. Oh, man, it's written in French. And then, of course, somebody translated it, and everybody was happy again. So we started reading Piaget, and then he traveled to the United States. And you can see, if you Google him, you can see some of the interviews that we had with him. He brought his daughter, and one of his daughters, he had like 6 kids, but he brought one of his daughters as a translator. Because he didn't speak English. He also didn't speak German or Italian, I don't think. Anyway, he spoke French almost exclusively. So once again, the reason we didn't read Piaget is because of politics, as dumb as that sounds. And so we were, when we became a little bit more liberal in the 70s and 80s, that was the end of the Vietnam War. We were feeling a little bit more liberal. We started reading theorists that were outside our scope of politics. And by golly, we had started doing some of these things that Vygotsky and Piaget suggested. We started looking beyond Erickson. We started looking beyond behaviorism because that wasn't really working. So if you look at what was going on in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of angry kids. There were a lot of grouchy and mean parents. And one of the reasons is because that was the theory, that was the accepted theory of the time. Watson and Skinner, they were trying to get you to condition your children to acting in a select way. But then, new theories came in, the humanists came in, Piaget and Vygotsky's were accepted. So a lot of this has to do with politics. As stupid as that sounds, a lot of it has to do with politics. Throughout our lifetimes, we are faced with the difficult task of changing our views in order to understand a new situation. Now, what does this have to do with education? Why in the world are we talking about this? And why didn't somebody else tell you that Piaget and Vygotsky weren't read because of politics? And the answer is because we focus on one thing. We tend to focus on one thing. And because I lived through it, and because I not only have degrees in psychology, but I also have degrees in medical laboratory technology, and English, and in political science. I'm a little bit more well-rounded, and so I can talk about this kind of stuff because I saw it, I watched it happen. It happened while I was on my watch, as it were. A lot of individuals that are teaching you have only studied in one area, and of course, education doesn't want to admit that they were being manipulated by politics. But we even are today, and of course, this whole voucher system and the defunding of public schools, that's all political. It's just all political. So who knows? Banning of books and whatnot. Oh golly, a lot of stuff is changing, and we'll have to watch to see if good things happen or bad things happen. And that's what was going on in the 50s and 60s. We were ignoring people that we didn't trust. That was Piaget and Vygotsky because they wrote in the wrong language, or they came from a communist country. Anyway, throughout our lifetimes, we are faced with the difficult task of changing our views in order to understand a new situation. Disequilibrium is a state where our current understanding is insufficient to make sense of a new experience. In other words, no longer does our understanding of meeting the demands of the new situation. I put something wrong in there. In order to restore equilibrium, we must adapt to this new situation, a process that Piaget called equilibration. Piaget argued that individuals are inherently driven to correct a state of disequilibrium in order to adapt to new situations. An organized understanding of related elements, Piaget called a scheme, and this is a scheme. The idea that this is a dog. Now she's identified the dog. She's identified this moving creature as a dog. She sees another creature moving, and she says, "Doggy." Well, it's not a dog; it's a cat. And so that's how we learn. This is a scheme. This is the idea. When an existing schema is satisfactorily used to explain a new experience, this illustrates the process of assimilation. And that's what's happened with the dog. When an existing schema is altered to account for a new experience, this experience exemplifies the process of accommodation. And that's what's happened with the cat. She sees this moving creature. She thinks all moving creatures are referred to as doggies. So when she sees another moving creature, she calls it a doggy. And because it's not a doggy, it's a kitty, she has to change her way of thinking, that there are two different types of moving creatures. One is a dog and the other is a cat, and that is known as accommodation. At first, she assimilated the idea of moving creature and the word doggy together, and then she had to change it. And this is all a schema. Using the processes of assimilation and accommodation, the developing child learns to adapt their thinking to their experiences. This allows enormous flexibility in how children establish their unique way of being in the world and also creates a constantly changing understanding of the world. According to Piaget, these cognitive changes are not stored randomly. Rather, he saw humans as incredible organizers who inherit a basic tendency to organize experiences and knowledge into meaningful associations. Each new experience a child encounters results in new information. Sometimes experiences merely underscore the child's current understanding of the world. That's assimilation. Other experiences require the child to modify his current understanding in order to make sense of the new experience. That's known as accommodation. Either way, the child becomes more knowledgeable. Piaget believed that as we acquire new information and knowledge, we naturally look for connections to existing information. We look for similarities and differences between the new and the old information. And consequently, we move toward an understanding of the world that is a closer approximation to the complex world in which we live. Piaget based his theory of cognitive development on observations of children. The basis for his theory, is simply that children change noticeably in the way they see the world as they get older. Piaget observed that younger children think not just fewer thoughts, but also think differently than older children. Thus, a 7-year-old can solve problems that a 4-year-old cannot, and a 4-year-old makes errors in reasoning that a 7-year-old will not. Piaget theorized that these changes are based both on maturation and adaptation, with children becoming able to adapt to new ways as they mature. Piaget believed that all humans develop cognitively in the same sequence of qualitative different stages, an idea termed invariant sequencing. So we learn to walk after we learn to crawl, and then we learn to run. That's invariant sequencing. Piaget outlined typical ages at which children reach each of the developmental stages. He also noted that individual children develop at different rates. It is also possible that some individuals may not move into the highest stages of cognitive development. Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operations. The sensory motor stage is so named because in this stage the child's primary mechanisms for exploring the world are sensory and motor. That's why everything goes into their mouth. They're trying to taste it, to see if it's food, to see what it is. That's how they touch it and they taste it. They're using 2 of their senses. Well, they're using 3 because they've also looked at it. Infants and toddlers think about their world through their ability to see and touch. Therefore, much of early learning is directly dependent on a child's ability to actively interact with people and objects. During this early period of cognitive development, the children achieve one of the first of Piaget's cognitive milestones, object permanence, understanding that things that are solid will stay there for an extended length of time. They do not disappear. Object permanence is a child's ability to mentally represent or think about an object after it has been removed from their field of vision or other senses. As an adult, it may be difficult to imagine a time when you did not appreciate that an object's permanence is independent of sight or touch, but this is a unique mental ability early in life. For most children, the beginning of an understanding of object permanence occurs during the first year. The presence or lack of object permanence can be observed by watching a child's behavior after an object has been removed from her field of vision. Children who have not yet acquired object permanence will typically treat the removal of an interesting object with indifference, not even looking for the object when it is gone. Quite simply, if it is out of sight, it no longer exists. Once a child has begun to achieve object permanence, she will look for the object moving in a deliberate manner to reacquire it. Object permanence is directly related to a tendency toward intentional behavior. Intentional behavior refers to the purposeful manipulation of the environment to achieve an outcome. Early in the sensory motor period, children fail to differentiate between the outside world and their own bodies, with self and the environment seen as roughly equivalent. As children develop, they become aware that they are able to control some aspects of the world and that there is a difference between self-control and manipulation of the environment. Through trial and error, children begin to develop better control over their bodies in the process of manipulating the environment. Consequently, becoming better able to interact with the world and meet their needs. Their behavior has moved from being almost random to being purposeful and goal-directed. When children enter the pre-operational stage, they're not so dependent on actual experiences. Instead, they develop better ways of representing things mentally. Piaget referred to our application of mental resources as operations. Mental resources, as thus children in the pre-operational period, are laying the groundwork necessary for the concrete operations developed in the next stage. One of the necessary steps toward development of operations is symbolic representation, or the ability to represent an object or experience with a symbol. And some of the symbols are what you're looking at right now. Letters that make sounds, numbers that mean something. Piaget referred to the use of symbolic representation as semiotic function. A child's ability to use symbolic representation develops rapidly during the pre-operational period. This is especially true for language development, which is perhaps the most sophisticated use of symbolic representation. Despite the dramatic development of symbolic thinking in the pre-operational period, mental activity of the children in this stage is still far from abstract. The thinking of the child in the pre-operational period is still tied to symbols of actual objects rather than abstract concepts or immediate experiences, and problems are solved based only on what is actually perceived. Piaget referred to children's thinking of this stage as egocentric, or the inability to view the world from someone else's perspective. This is commonly seen in children's play behavior. Egocentric behavior. The reliance on perception leads to errors in reasoning such as centration, or the inability to think of more than one aspect of a problem at a time. Like egocentric thinking, centration is a problem with being bound by one's perceptions. For adults and children alike, every situation has certain elements that capture our attention more so than others. As individuals grow, they develop greater facility in directing their attention and thoughts to factors other than those that may be more salient for the individual. The child in the pre-operational period is quite limited in this ability. Typically, they are drawn to the most salient aspect of a situation and have difficulty attending to other aspects of their environment. Transformation, the sequence of changes when a situation is transformed. Reversibility, the ability to mentally represent and undo events in a logical sequence. These are errors in reasoning experienced by children in the pre-operational period. Over time, children adapt their thinking to enable them to better operate within their world And many reasoning errors characteristic of the preoperational period are resolved as the child moves into the concrete operational stage. And this kid is writing on the wall. Never good. During the concrete operational stage, children move beyond strict ties to perceptions in favor of logical reasoning. As children gain a greater appreciation of the workings of the world, they're able to recognize perceptual irregularities and reason through situations where things are not as they appear to be by using logic. This is a significant step forward in mental ability. It is made possible by the resolution of several issues prominent during the preoperational period. The child in the concrete operational period is now able to accurately solve problems of conservation. They're able to decenter their thinking from the most salient features of the problem to a consideration of other relevant factors. Concrete operational children are also able to mentally reverse a transformation. Recall that a child in the preoperational period has difficulty holding a sequence of events in memory and logically reversing the sequence from end to beginning. Children in the concrete operational stage are able to make such two-way logical deductions. If given index cards with pictures of the beginning, ending, and intermediate stages of ball illustration, a concrete operational child can place them in order from the end state through the intermediate steps to the beginning state. Children in the concrete operational stage develop a far more elaborate structure for the classification of objects. Classification is the ability to mentally organize observed similarities and differences in the environment. Instead of only having knowledge of simple categories, children are able to understand the complex relations between membership in multiple categories. Complex classification requires decentered thinking, as children must think about more than one aspect of the problem at a time. As children move through the concrete operational stage, they begin to develop more intricate category relations, allowing them to think about the world in new ways. Another concept mastered during the concrete operational stage is seriation, or the ability to arrange objects into an orderly sequence. Seriation applies to a variety of object dimensions, including length, mass, and volume. And of course, this is by length. One of Piaget's classic seriation tasks involves presenting a child with a set of sticks of varying lengths, and the child is then asked to put the sticks in order from smallest to largest. Preoperational children have difficulty with this task, even when the solution is demonstrated for them. Children in concrete operations are able to complete the task accurately, recognizing that any one stick in the sequence has two important relations. That is, it is a larger than the sticks before it, or in the sequence, and yet smaller than the sticks coming after it in the sequence. This realization allows them to appropriately place the sticks in order. Formal operational stage is in many ways similar to the concrete operational stage. Individuals at this stage develop sophisticated classification systems. They're also able to logically reason in forward and reverse directions. The fundamental difference in reasoning at the formal operational stage is that individuals are now able to use their reasoning abilities for situations with which they have had no direct experience. For this reason, formal operational reasoning is frequently referred to as might-be reasoning, whereby individuals are able to apply their reasoning and problem solving to completely abstract issues. The ability to think independently of specific examples or context is important because it allows for general principles and methods of thinking. Individuals capable of formal operational reasoning are able to explore ideas that are completely hypothetical. For example, hypothetico-deductive reasoning is the ability to speculate about how a particular situation functions and then test the prediction or guess. While it is beneficial to be able to reason about the possible outcomes of a particular situation without having to wait for the situation to actually resolve, individuals in early stages of formal operations often use this newfound ability in a more universal way than is actually productive. Adolescents moving into the formal operations stage are likely to vigorously argue points of politics, religion, or morality based on ideas they have been able to deduce through logic. These logical deductions appear to them to be flawless and as immutable as actual reality. However, they often fail to recognize potential validity in other perspectives. Piaget referred to an adolescent's focus on their own thoughts and the inability to see the perspective of others as adolescent egocentrism. Adolescents recognize that others have a different perspective. The difference in the two types of egocentrism is that adolescents are often so convinced by their own logic that they assume anyone who challenges their reasoning is demonstrating flawed judgment. They fail to recognize that there may be factors of which others are aware that they, the adolescents, have not considered, or assumptions which they have made that are not valid. If an adolescent recognizes that others have a different perspective, but they invalidate that perspective, it makes it difficult to benefit from that perspective. In a functional sense, they are also being egocentric since they are not benefiting from the perspective of others. Research indicates that this type of reasoning may extend into early adulthood. As individuals progress in their mastery of formal operations, they become better able to understand that multiple perspectives exist with regard to abstract problems, and their thinking becomes less egocentric. Piaget's notion of adolescent egocentrism helps to explain the idealism and functioning of authority that may occur during adolescence. And while this may not make it easier to relate to adolescence, it does help to inform our understanding of adolescent behavior and its relation to cognitive development. Piaget seems to have underestimated, and Piaget made mistakes. Piaget seems to have underestimated the cognitive abilities of infants and toddlers and overestimated the reasoning capacity of adolescents. Studies have shown that only 50 to 60% of 18 to 20-year-olds were adept formal reasoners. Thus, Piaget's ideas regarding the typical age at which formal operational thinking is reached may have overestimated the abilities of adolescents and adults. Research also provides evidence for an upward trend in the percentage of 13 to 15-year-olds proficient with formal reasoning, with a 1967 study finding that 5% were mature formal operators, and a 1996 study finding that 15% were consistently able to reason at a formal level. This increase in the percentage of formal thinkers was attributed to a greater tendency for teachers to instruct, with a greater tendency for teachers to instruct with tables and diagrams that require more formal types of thinking, suggesting that formal operational thinking may be influenced by education more than initially proposed. Another often cited criticism of Piaget's work is his tendency to ignore the impact of social interactions and culture. Although a careful review of Piaget's work indicates an ongoing concern with the impact of social interactions, he did not articulate a clear mechanism for how social interactions and culture affect cognitive development. Studies specifically examining Piaget's theory across cultures have generally supported the order of Piaget's stages. but have found cultural differences in the rate of progression through the stages. Studies also indicate that there may be differences in rate of progression through stages between socioeconomic groups within a particular culture. These findings suggest that culture may play a more central role in development than Piaget's theory assumes. A growing group of researchers, generally referred to as neo-Piagetian theorists, attempt to retain much of Piaget's original insight and to extend those insights to better account for the latest research findings. Most neo-Piagetian theorists maintain the stage-like approach proposed by Piaget, but they have refined what defines a stage. Rather than viewing development as a stage, which generally corresponds to the years of age, newer research has supposed the idea that stages exist within a specific domain, such as motor development, math ability, or social ability. Development within one domain does not necessarily indicate development in other domains, and there is much variability in individual strengths and weaknesses. Using chronological age as a benchmark for development is therefore problematic because it may or may not apply to all domain areas. Recall that according to Piaget's theory, a child becomes motivated to learn when his representations of the world are challenged by new, conflicting information. Piaget referred to this as a state of disequilibrium and argued that children have a natural tendency to find ways to alter their existing schemas so they can incorporate the new information. This returns them to a state of equilibrium. This is an important point to consider when providing developmentally appropriate instruction. That is, instruction should be tailored to challenge a child's existing schema by producing disequilibrium. In order to optimize the construction of knowledge, teachers must challenge children to go beyond existing mental structures so that the equilibration process begins. Piaget's theory is also notable for his view that children actively construct knowledge of the world through active exploration. Since the publication of this theory, this idea of knowledge construction has developed steadily and is becoming a primary area of focus in education. While all teachers should strive to develop appropriate instructional methods, Piaget has taught us that it is equally important to pay attention to the learning process from the perspective of the student. Learners are not merely passive recipients of the knowledge taught by the instructor, but are actively constructing their understanding. Despite considerable attention in the scientific literature on the differences between Piaget and Vygotsky, there are actually many similarities between their theories. Both theorists are constructivists. Both theories have as central tenets the idea that knowledge and learning are active processes and that each child constructs his own understanding of the world. They both discuss the role of social interaction in development, including interpersonal interactions, cultural interactions, and historical influences. While Vygotsky placed interactions at the center of his theory, Piaget was less specific about how social interactions influence development. Piaget's theory follows a contextualizing approach, which means that development is influenced by social interactions but is a distinct process that is driven by children's exploration of the world. Piaget saw the importance of considering the context in which a child develops, but he emphasized that development is still primarily occurring within and because of the child. Vygotsky's contextual approach, on the other hand, places no such boundary between the social world and an individual's development within that context. He saw individuals as deriving their thinking from larger societal patterns of thinking and saw distinguishing between the two as unnecessary and inappropriate. While the theories of Vygotsky and Piaget have fundamental differences, they can be used in a complementary manner, as can be seen in the constructivist approach to teaching and learning. The theories of both Piaget and Vygotsky embody this perspective without minimizing the importance of a learner's interactions in the environment. For Piaget, these interactions involve active exploration of the environment and symbolic representations of the world. For Vygotsky, the interactions with the environment that shape thinking are social and language-based. Now we're going to talk about language development. Language is communication of ideas using symbols, semiotics. These symbols may be spoken, written, or expressed in a manual form of communication, such as sign language. For example, the word cat symbolizes a specific small furry animal. Understanding the meaning of the words is referred to as semantics. The first of the 5 components of language we will cover. When we speak the word cat, we are semantically representing the idea of this animal through expressive language or language production. To understand or comprehend the word cat, when it is spoken, one uses receptive language. Words are not the only way that we can represent ideas. Syntax, our second component of language, is our ability to put words together in a certain order to represent more complicated ideas. For example, the cat ran from the dog was a very different meaning from the dog ran from the cat. Changing single words in minor ways can dramatically affect meaning. In spoken languages, letters represent certain sounds or phonemes. Phonology is our third component of language and refers to speech sounds. Phonemes have no meaning when standing alone. For example, the letter C in the word cat is meaningless by itself. Change the C to an R, however, and the meaning of the word and the sentence changes. And there's a cat chasing a rat. And by golly, my cat brought in a vole. And voles kind of look like that, except they have a shorter tail. Anyway, my cat brought in a vole to give to one of the other cats, and now they're playing with it in there. And I think it's escaped. Oh, good. The fourth component of language is morphemes, or the smallest unit of meaning in a language, such as the affixes placed at the beginning or ending of word stems, such as ed, ing, and un. Morphemes can be single letters or combinations of letters. Adding the letter S to the word dog changes the number of animals represented because in English, adding S to the end of a noun usually makes the noun plural. And we got a long-legged dog, we got a short-legged dog, there we go. The fifth component of language involves the social aspects of communication or pragmatics. Pragmatic language allows us to communicate appropriately within a given context, such as taking turns in a conversation, standing an appropriate distance away from the person to whom we are speaking, and providing feedback to indicate that we are listening. Before we review these components in more detail, let's first look at 2 general theories about the acquisition of language. Now, this is really kind of interesting. The personal space that people demand. I used to work with a lady from Canada, and Canadians have this huge personal space that they want to keep. So it's really kind of interesting. I'm from Indiana, where we also have this large area of personal space that we require, especially us farm guys that lived out on the tractor for most of our lives. Anyway, it was kind of interesting because if you saw the 2 of us talking with each other, one of us was standing on one wall and the other was talking on at the other wall. We never got anywhere closer than an arm's length away from each other. So that's 2 arm's lengths actually, because my arm's length and her arm's length, and that's about as close as we ever got. It's really kind of funny to watch. But other individuals, I didn't have any problem getting closer to. It was just that her personal space was a lot bigger than most people's, especially the Dene people. You guys stand a little bit closer to each other. Okay, we're talking about theories of language development. The linguist Noam Chomsky became world famous in the 1960s by proposing that humans come into the world pre-wired to acquire language, possessing what he called a language acquisition device, or an LAD. His theory that humans are born pre-programmed to acquire language, or the nativist perspective, emphasizes the role of biology in maturation and the nature side of the nature-nurture debate. Now, that's really kind of interesting because he's still alive and he's 98 years old. He's grown a beard. His hair, he looks like Einstein with his hair. But yeah, he's still alive, Noam Chomsky. He used to give speeches, I mean, up until he was in his like 95 years old. Not so much anymore. According to Chomsky's original ideas, humans are born with an innate understanding of the basic functions of language. He referred to this as the deep structure of language. Deep language structure was then translated into our overt language, the surface structure, based on the language used in our particular cultural environment. When I was starting in college in 1967, I was given a book by Noam Chomsky to read before I started college. Really kind of interesting. He and S.I. Hayakawa um, had these theories of language and language acquisition. It was really kind of fascinating. But I read Chomsky, you know, what, 50 years ago, 55 years ago. This process was called transformational grammar. This theory directly contrasts the behaviorist notion that the environment or nurture is responsible for the acquisition of language. And this was part of the liberalization of the ideas of education. Remember, I talked about the behaviorism. Behaviorists were very strict. They said that we were conditioned to all the things that we learned, we were conditioned to learn those things. And people didn't like that. Humanists didn't like that. So we started reading different theories. And of course, at that point, Vygotsky and Piaget we started reading different foreign ideas. Behaviorism is primarily an American idea. It came out of Watson and Skinner. And for the longest time, it dominated psychology. But then in the late 60s, early 70s, we started liberalizing this stuff. And it was people like Chomsky that changed our ideas of things. Another developmental phenomenon which points to maturation as an important process in language acquisition is the fact that children develop language at a phenomenal rate. At around 18 to 24 months, children experience a tremendous increase in vocabulary, learning up to 20 new words per week. The average 2-year-old with her 200-word vocabulary will have learned to recognize around 10,000 new words by the time she enters first grade, and 30,000 more by the time she reaches the fifth grade. Eric Linneberg in the 1960s explained difficulty with learning language, proposing that there is a window of opportunity for acquiring language easily. He proposed a critical period in language development, a window of opportunity that is strongest initially, early in childhood, and ends around adolescence. Linneberg based his ideas on research findings with individuals who had brain injuries in the language area of the brain, causing a loss of language skills, a clinical condition known as aphasia. Adults with aphasia require intensive therapy to reestablish even rudimentary language skills, while children with aphasia often recover in a manner that appears effortless. Since the development of the critical period hypothesis, many studies have been completed that support the idea of a window of opportunity in language development, at least for acquired syntax. Many contemporary theorists prefer to refer to this window as sensitive rather than a critical period in development. The fact that we learn second languages in adulthood, for example, even if it is effortful, indicates the window of opportunity never really closes. Contemporary theorists argue that humans are biologically predisposed to learn language easily early in life and relatively the same way. These are people that are trying to argue with Chomsky. We learn language easily, not because of a language acquisition device, but for the same reason that we all develop cognitively in much the same way, because we all have brains that develop or mature in a similar manner. Brain development supports this interactionist view of language development. Research indicates that infants come into the world biologically primed to make synaptic connections in their brains as a function of experience, exposure to language. Also supporting this biological predisposition is the finding that most people use the left hemisphere for processing language. Most people have highly organized areas of neuronal connection existing in the same location in the brain, suggesting that we may have specific neurons that are genetically pre-programmed to make connections when exposed to language. Several processes interact with maturation and learning in the development of language, including cognitive, motivational, and social factors. Research shows that language development and cognitive development are strongly linked with children's use of language, adapting along with their changing understanding of the world. Language also serves a social communicative function. We're motivated to use language because we want to express our ideas and understanding of the world, but also so that others can understand our ideas. We may learn to use grammatically correct sentences because it is necessary for us to interact with others socially. Many integrationists believe that the process of a child's interacting with others who are linguistically more sophisticated initiates the development of the brain's language centers, which in turn allows a child to interact in new ways. Language develops in much the same way and at about the same time for most people. Language learning proceeds through a series of developmental milestones, first words, joining words, etc. Teachers should have a basic understanding of linguistic trends. Motes and Lyon in 1996 assert that a new approach to teacher education is needed that emphasizes the importance of language knowledge for literacy instruction, as well as its skilled application to instructional planning. The songs and rhymes preschool children love serve an important purpose, that is, they are exercises in receptive phonology. When we try to think of a word that rhymes with cat, we might exchange the C for an R, manipulating the speech sounds so that the word we choose, in this case rat, sounds the same except for the beginning. In kindergarten, much of the curriculum centers on the development of sound, symbol correspondence, or learning that each letter has a particular sound. In first grade, most children begin to understand that words are made up of these speech sounds blended in left to right order, whether this is taught implicitly or explicitly. Some children, however, do not have a good phonological awareness skills, and research shows that these children may have difficulty learning to read. Phonological awareness refers to the ability to recognize different units of sound within words. Research also suggests that children who show problems with phonological awareness may require instruction that is tailored to their individual learning needs to avoid reading failure and later diagnosis of learning disability. Expressive phonology involves the production of speech sounds. During the years, it is not atypical for children to have difficulty producing some of the sounds in their native language, especially the letters S, TH, th, s, z, with a Z and a V sound. V. These problems may persist in early elementary school, resolving without intervention. Pronunciation problems that are very severe or that hinder communication may require speech-language articulation interventions. Children with expressive phonology problems respond well to this treatment. Many collaborative techniques have also been developed as alternatives for the traditional articulation interventions. A morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning in a language. Morphemes may be single words, grammatical modifiers such as prefixes and suffixes, or the inflection used to convey a specific meaning in a sentence. Children begin to understand the rules for using grammatical morphemes such as the plural and possessive forms of nouns, the complicated conjugation of the verb to be, and the appropriate use of prepositions in the preschool years. Many preschoolers, in fact, overextend these rules, making errors in their use of grammatical morphemes. Most children start school with sophisticated and implicit knowledge of morphology rules, and this knowledge is further developed by explicit teaching. When we teach the formation of plural possessives or verb tenses, we're actually teaching the morphological rules of standard English. Many students find verb tenses and plural forms easy to learn since they naturally use these when speaking. Not all children have equal degrees of experience with the standard English morphology. Children who have limited English proficiency may be accustomed to using a language with different morphology rules. Cultural differences in English language use may also influence knowledge of standard English morphology. And what they're talking about are different accents. Last night I was listening to was watching a movie about the War of 1812. And the individual that was talking was from Baltimore, and he had a Baltimore accent. I know this because I used to serve with a guy from Baltimore. He had exactly the same accent where he didn't pronounce select words correctly. It wasn't standard English. So what Swartwood is talking about is the fact that there are people that have a different dialect, who speak different dialects of English, not standard English, and that is maybe interfering with their learning of English and their ability to read and write, strangely enough. Just like that individual that I was listening to from Baltimore with that distinctive Baltimoreese accent. It's the same way. The author of your book, Swartwood, is from Upper New York State, and of course, if you talk to people from New York, talk to people from Boston or from Rhode Island. I used to have a girlfriend from Rhode Island. Horrible accent, just a horrible accent. Um, they, of course, have problems spelling things because they pronounce their vowels differently, as interesting as that is. And that's what Swartwood is talking about. He's specifically talking about Ebonics. Ebonics is the black dialect, the African American patois that hardly anybody speaks anymore. I mean, it's not nearly as prevalent as it was back when education was different, when a lot of schools were segregated. Now that they're not segregated and that we still teach standard English, then a lot of the dialects are actually disappearing, and standard English is more common. I had a colleague from North Carolina who had an interesting dialect. Since a child's sophistication with morphology rules can influence reading and spelling skills, this places this places many students at a distinct disadvantage. when learning to read, spell, and express their thoughts in written form. Moving to a second language can have disruptive effects on morphological structure that persist into adulthood. This issue lies at the heart of controversy regarding whether teaching should be accomplished using standard English or students' primary language or dialect. And of course, the problem with teaching their primary language or dialect means that they won't learn standard English. And I'm not exactly sure why in the world he's mentioning this, but I'm guessing he has an accent, and that's why he's doing this. Semantics refers to the meaningful basis of language, both of individual words and combinations of words. Children understand far more than they can produce, or their receptive language is more advanced than their expressive language at all ages. Preschoolers show not only exponential growth in their vocabularies, they also begin to understand and use relational words such as high, low, in, on, and here, there. According to research, vocabulary knowledge increases from around 10,000 words in first grade to around 40,000 words in fifth grade. Some research indicates that children from low-income backgrounds may have heard only 50% of the words and can understand only 50% of the meanings of words understood by children from high-income backgrounds, putting them at a distinct disadvantage in the classroom. There are increasing numbers of students in the United States with limited English proficiency. These students may have typical or even advanced vocabularies in their native languages, but they are a significant disadvantage at an English-only school. All languages have syntax or rules for word order. Most of us speak in syntactically correct sentences. The order in which we place our words follows the rules of English. Even preschool children follow these rules, although they have never been explicitly taught to do so. Trying to learn the syntactical rules of English explicitly is often quite difficult, even for a native English speaker. When we are able to think about language and language rules by reflecting on language itself, instead of using it to communicate, we are showing metalinguistic awareness. Metalinguistic awareness increases significantly with age, allowing us to understand and use sentences that are increasingly complex. Pragmatic language, or communicating appropriately in a given context, has a significant impact on a student's social functioning. Students with pragmatic language problems may have difficulty using language in a socially acceptable manner. They may speak too loudly, stand too closely, enter conversations inappropriately, or interrupt because they have trouble taking turns in a conversation. They may also have trouble understanding the verbal and nonverbal communication cues of others, including understanding facial expressions, body language, or other nonverbal hints. Now, this is really kind of interesting because what I want you to think about is all the professors you have at Dene College, we all have about the same, we all speak just about the same, and what we are speaking is standard English, whether it's Dr. Russ, Dr. Barber, Dr. Robinson's from Ohio. I'm trying to think of somebody else. Just about everybody has the same language pattern. But there is a guy from the Ukraine, and I'm trying to think of what his name is. Anyway, his speech pattern is different if you think about it. So no matter who the individual is, whether they're in business, Dr. Blackwater, James Denny, everybody has about the same speech pattern. And it's because it's all standard English. Just kind of curious. So the next time you go to a class, I want you to listen to that person. And if they have a different dialect, I want you to tell me about it, okay? I'm just curious. One area of difficulty for children with pragmatic language problems involves understanding the true meaning of an indirect request. A child with pragmatic language problems may not understand a request that is phrased as a question and answer yes to the question, "Must you tap your pencil?" This is from Hit Me Baby One More Time. That's Britney Spears. I think that was her first hit, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, that's the beginning of the video. This type of response causes others to think the child is being oppositional when the child simply missed the point of the indirect request. This is an important aspect of language functioning to consider in the classroom. Research shows that teachers ask politely quite frequently, with some studies showing rates as high as 2% of the utterances of K through 8 teachers consisting of indirect requests, in which case it's not a command, it's a request. Most pragmatic rules are implicit. No one ever really teaches us out loud that we should stand a distance of around 2 feet away from a stranger with whom we are conversing. Yet we feel very uncomfortable when someone violates this rule. We learn pragmatic language skills through our interactions with others over time. Many pragmatic rules are culturally mediated, including loudness of voice, amount of eye contact, and use of gestures. Non-native English speakers have been shown to have difficulty understanding appropriate responses for initiating and maintaining conversations, as well as for adjusting request strategies to meet classroom norms. It is frequently very difficult to identify exactly where a student is having difficulty in a conversation or interaction, much less to explicitly teach the subtle language skills that will help him better navigate socially in the classroom. And that is finally it. Okay, I almost went to sleep there for a while. So I'll talk to you guys next week.